Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here to present Marta Lilia Espinosa Tavares, who received this year's Charles A. Hale Fellowship for Mexican History. This award was generously established some years ago by Charles A. Hale's family, along with LASA, as a memorial scholarship for the advanced studies of Mexican history. As you may know, Charles A. Hale was a distinguished scholar known for his research on the intellectual history of Mexican liberalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I had the opportunity to meet him, and he was a great professor. This fellowship is meant to reward excellence in historical research of a Mexican graduate student in the final phase of his or her doctoral research in Mexican history, broadly defined. The selection is based on scholarly merit and on potential contribution to the advancement of humanist understanding between Mexico and its global neighbors. This year, I had the privilege to chair the selection committee, which included Professor Ana María Serna from Instituto de Investigaciones Dr. José Luis Mora and Professor Gema Coppel Santa Maria from George Washington University. It was a very difficult task to choose among several brilliant, innovative, and well-researched dissertations that tell of the great work that young historians are currently carrying out and of the bright future of the field. However, after carefully studying all proposals independently, we concluded that Marta Liliana Espinosa Tavares' dissertation stood out by the originality of its topic, the quality of its research, and its relevance in terms of its contributions to the historiography. Thus, we unanimously decided that the fellowship should be awarded to her. Her dissertation deals with a problem of great importance for global and Mexican history, the development of contraceptive pills and the change in public policies towards population growth and birth control. It is based on a thorough research of original sources and the combination of several historical perspectives, social, intellectual, gender, and the history of science. It shows how the joint efforts of Mexican chemists, doctors, economists, and demographers, supported with transnational alliances, contributed to the global science of family planning between 1930 and 1980. It also demonstrates that local experts dodged the opposition of state officials and the Catholic Church to birth control and became key actors in testing the contraceptive pill on Mexican women in the late 1950s. It places Mexico in a central role in the development of contraceptives, not only the production of synthetic steroid hormones, as Professor Soto Laveaga, who is present here, and others have shown, but also because it was a crucial hub for testing the pill. Its findings challenge the traditional narratives about population control and contraceptive technologies as global North policies imposed on poor countries and support the view of Mexican developmentalists as part of the vanguard of modernism. We consider that this work will become a mandatory reference not only for global studies on population control, but also for those dealing with the history of science and technology, gender, family, the Catholic Church, and state formation in Mexico during the 20th century. Congratulations, Marta Liliana. I hope this fellowship helps you turn this dissertation into a wonderful book. Well, now I think we'll have some words by Professor Gabriela Soto Laveaga from Harvard University.
Thank you so much, Professor Gómez-Galvarriato, and it's such a pleasure to meet you. I have so long admired you, and it is a real pleasure of mine to be able to give some comments on Marta Liliana's wonderful dissertation, and a really path-breaking book, path-breaking work, not just as Professor Aurora said in History of Science, but also in our reinterpretation of the meanings of womanhood and the practice of contraception in early Mexico, which to my knowledge had not been studied as thoroughly before. So there's 4 main points that I feel that this dissertation is making, and that it will have a larger impact, not just in the historiography of modern Mexico, but for a larger understanding of the transformative impact of understanding women's bodies in a different way for Latin America and more broadly in the world. But I want to start with one key point. Liliana shows us in her dissertation the deep international connections that were had between, in this case, the United States birth control movement led by Margaret Sanger and her organizations, and Mexico. By making these links, while we know that Mexico was a pivotal anchor in the transformation, not transformation, but the passage of knowledge, here it really becomes a concrete dialogue between experts in Mexico and experts in the United States, who are retaking knowledge that is circulating around the world and reformatting it for specific Mexican case. And this, I think, is your major contribution. By linking it to what's happening in early 20th century Mexico with the Cristero War, with the social transformations happening with Cardenismo, and putting in the quest to find birth control, puts this on the same plane as understanding what a post-revolutionary Mexico is within this conversation that is being had around the world. And so that's one, the international connections. The other one that I think is one of the most important contributions is this changing idea of what pregnancy is, but also what women's bodies are. And it's not this notion that, for example, with Dr. Carrillo, who's a prominent person in your work, that he's the one who is pushing to look at the social conditions and to understand that to implement birth control is also to advance the nation in a progressive way. And it's also about women's health, which is something that up until then had not been so clearly articulated, that how important women's health was for this burgeoning post-revolutionary Mexico. But it's also that birth control at the time is not seen as a woman's reproductive autonomy. And you make this very clear, that though it's about women's health, this is still linked to what the nation is. So many of the proponents that we are seeing here at the beginning of the 20th century, in which you highlight, Liliana, it's about national progress. And it's not about individual women and individual women's rights, but it's about how can better citizens be produced? So in this neo-Lamarckian understanding that a better society can produce better citizens, birth control is going to play a big role. But in order to have birth control, you need to have a better understanding of women's bodies, and hence this exchange that you're having, not just with the United States, but with Europe, which is, and you trace so beautifully and so wonderfully through individual people. Now, this idea that the government, so the political connections really become important. And I'm thinking here of Hazel Moore, who's a prominent representative of Margaret Sanger's work, who's in Mexico. And despite her rather backward comments and understanding of Mexico, what she's interesting that she has a clear voice at this time because of her personal and political connections to very to well-connected politicians, doctors, and others within Mexico. And I think this is another one of your contributions, how certain ideas begin to circulate because of the connections, political and otherwise, that are being had in the 1920s and 1930s in Mexico. So the ideas, the power that Hazel Moore is capable of doing and propagating certain ideas, it's because she has access to these individuals who have power in Mexico. it's interesting to think what ideas would have circulated or what other potential ideas or plans might have made it through in society had Hazel Moore not had, just using her as a case, these connections within the Mexican government and larger Mexican society. But at the end, what comes to the foreground is that even though many of these ideas are being pushed by upper middle class and upper class Mexican women, mainly urban, the plan is in this eugenicist idea that it will be the urban poor and the rural poor that should benefit the most from these contraceptive devices. And obviously for me, one of the most exciting things to read was about Sanitol, the spermicide, and which you argue was the first chemical technology, birth control technology that was being used in Mexico. So that for me was really terrific to read. And one of the other aspects that I thought was really brilliantly done in your dissertation was how you tie in, for example, Gilberto Loyo, who's the pioneer of modern geography in Mexico, to these burgeoning ideas of not, and this is separate from what's happening in the United States, which is about also women's rights, but here where it's about the role that natalism and pronatalism are going to play in Mexico. So what you weave is a really interesting arc where after the revolution in Mexico, where the population has suffered so tremendously, and the idea is really that to populate is to make a better Mexico. And your ability to bring in these ideas, which we've long understood that was the goal, to more Mexicans for a better Mexico. But here, the change is better Mexicans for a progressive and a better Mexico. And I think this is where Loyo and Mexican feminists, but also eugenicists are coming together to build this idea of what a Mexico can be. And this is where I think your work is so important, because it places this idea of reproduction, not just in the hands of policymakers and those who are envisioning a Mexico that will become a stronger, healthier nation, but rather you're also bringing in the voices of key women in this discussion. So it's not a male-dominated discourse, but it's also females who are, but there's this whole spectrum of female voices, those who are prominent Catholics, but also have a different idea of what birth control should be used for, and those who religion is not a driving force, but that are seeing a much more progressive Mexico. Which leads me to one of my final comments. We have often understood a black-white understanding of birth control and the church, and here you complicate this idea a bit more. That it's not a black-white situation, but rather it's much more on the grayer scale in terms of the relationship that the Catholic Church had with these ideas of contraception. And in this terrific dissertation, which you're bringing many of these contradictions, you're not just putting them on the table, but you're integrating them into conversations that exist about post-revolutionary Mexico, that they're not ancillary conversations that are being had on the side, but they are being had by prominent politicians. We're talking about Lázaro Cárdenas, we're talking about the key scientist of the time, but we had not dug deeper. We really needed you, Liliana, to write this dissertation. And I want to congratulate you for this terrific piece, which this work, which I cannot wait to read as a book. And I also want to congratulate the committee for being able to see how important this work was as a cog to give us all a better understanding of where feminist ideas were much earlier than we have given them credit for. These ideas of birth control were taking root in Mexico, but most importantly, that Mexico was a hub for these ideas, and understanding that in a way that had not been explicitly stated before. So for that, I thank you so much. I think you're muted, Aurora.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriela. You made a wonderful description of this dissertation, which I am also looking forward to reading as a book. And now I would like Marta Liliana to present us some of her work directly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aurora and Dr. Gabriela, for your wonderful introductions. Oh, sorry. Oh, my apologies. Thank you
Aurora,
so much.
could you mute yours?
Am I muted?
I can hear you now.
No, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. Okay. My apologies for these logistical issues. I was saying thank you so much, Dr. Aurora. Thank you. And Dr. Gabriela for your wonderful introductions. I'm very humbled to be part of this wonderful list of awardees of the Charles A. Hale Award. And I just want to say how honored and what an incredible experience this has been. And I just prepared a very short presentation of my dissertation. And now I'm afraid that I won't do such a great job as Dr. Gabriela introducing my own work. I am amazed by how you summarized my project, and yes, I'm just incredibly excited. So just to begin. In my dissertation, I explore how Mexican doctors, demographers, chemists, and economists contributed to what I call the science of family planning. The constellation of research on contraceptive technologies, demographic theories, and graduate education that had as a common goal to intervene in the population's reproductive behavior. From the eugenics movement that blossomed in Mexico in the 1930s to the proliferation of family planning clinics in the 1970s, I interrogate how the production of knowledge on contraception persisted despite the strength of the Catholic Church and the pronatalism that the Mexican government supposedly advocated. In this vein, inspired by Dr. Soto Laveaga's fundamental contribution to the historiography with jungle laboratories, I make the case that we must reassess Mexico's role in the global history of oral contraception. In addition to providing the world with the raw materials and the expertise to produce the synthetic hormones that led to the creation of the birth control pill, as Dr. Soto Laveaga has shown, I demonstrate that Mexico was one of the main experimental fields for human trials with this revolutionary pharmaceutical in the late 1950s. My archival research has led me to the documentary repositories located in Mexico, the US, and the UK. And I have assembled a corpus of analysis constituted by primary sources, such as the personal correspondence between some of the main advocates of birth control in Mexico since the late 1930s, semi-clandestine family planning clinics, which were dependent on contraceptive research funding, and graduate education programs created to train Mexican experts in the fields of chemistry and demography. Regarding this last set of sources, I would like to mention that the science of family planning had an influence in Mexico that surpassed the reach of birth control clinics. Firstly, the graduate program in organic chemistry at UNAM consolidated in the 1950s with the collaboration of Syntex and the interest of this company in training chemists that would work in their laboratories researching steroid hormones. Secondly, the master's program in demography at the Colegio de México was created in 1964 at the urgency of Mexican intellectuals, such as Victor Urquidi, to study how population growth impacted the country's economic development. Now, I would like to provide you with a brief outline of my dissertation chapters to give a better idea of how my project will look like as a finished dissertation. And in the first chapter, titled Smuggling Contraceptive Technologies in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, Eugenic Collaborations Between Physicians, Feminists, and US Birth Controllers During the Last Years of Cardenismo, I address the work of Mexican eugenicists and their alliances with foreign birth control activists trying to promote contraception in the late 1930s, as Dr. Soto Laveaga so wonderfully also summarized. Moreover, in this chapter, I explain how Mexican physicians and public health officials collaborated with agents from Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau to smuggle cans of spermicide foam powder into Mexico, Sanitol. The second chapter, a fertile ground for the development of the birth control pill, Mexican chemists, pharmaceutical companies, and fears of communism, 1944-1956, glosses over the creation of the pharmaceutical company Syntex in Mexico City in the mid-1940s, and its influence in the consolidation of the PhD program in organic chemistry at UNAM, from where the Mexican chemists who worked in the development of the birth control pill emerged. By also addressing the competition between Syntex and the US-based company Searle, I reveal how this American corporation, Searle, intended to start the first large-scale human trials with the pill in Mexico in 1956, and the reasons why it failed in this enterprise, which, as you may imagine, they have to do with communist presence in Mexico. And as you all know, these trials didn't happen in Mexico, but actually in Puerto Rico. The third chapter, Amenable Contraceptive Research, Human Trials with the Pill in Mexico City, 1959-1967, examines the creation of the first family planning clinic in the country in 1958, which was sponsored by Syntex in order to conduct human trials with their version of the pill, a drug known as Norlutin. Cautious of any nationalist or Catholic backlash, since this clinic was also supported by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, doctors had to develop the Mexican trials without drawing public attention. This means that physicians could not recruit patients openly, nor could they count on any institutional support from local public health officials. Rather, the clinic heavily depended on word-of-mouth publicity to get women to try the pill. So doctors had to gain the patient's trust and show them that they were more than disposable bodies at the service of science. Y bueno, en este capítulo yo analizo los reportes clínicos de estos estudios y trato de enfocarme también en el aspecto de autonomía reproductiva de las mujeres que asistían voluntariamente a esta clínica para recibir la píldora que estaba siendo estudiada. The fourth chapter, Mexican Demographers and the Birth of the Latin American Demographic Thought, analyzes how US-based donors and Mexican professionals allied to create the first master's program in demography in Mexico in 1964. The experts who received training in this program produced knowledge about Mexico's so-called demographic explosion, demonstrating how the population doubled every 20 years. Here, I show how despite engaging with the demographic thought developed in the US and Europe, particularly the demographic transition theory, Mexican demographers also challenged it, particularly, specifically, in the rejection of family planning as the panacea to the social and economic problems the country faced. And here I also want to show how women demographers from El Colegio de México, like Susana Lerner, were behind this creation of this demographic thought, and they advanced it in collaboration with Latin American demographers and intellectuals and dependency theorists. Finally, in the fifth chapter, FEPAC and the institutionalization of family planning, analyze the proliferation of private and public family planning clinics throughout the country from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s, and I touch a little bit of the early 1980s. In this chapter, I focus on the work of FEPAC, Fundación para Estudios de la Población AC, which was established by influential Mexican intellectuals, such as Eduardo Villaseñor, Víctor Urquidi, and Gilberto Loyo. FEPAC is known today as MexFam, and it constitutes one of the most important organizations in the provision of sexual and reproductive health services in the country, including the interrupción legal del embarazo in Mexico City clinics. And with this chapter, I expect to conclude my dissertation and hopefully finish the PhD program in the incoming spring of 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Marta Liliana. We have some few minutes, so if there's someone who would like to make some comments or questions, it would be possible. Although in this hybrid mode, it's kind of complicated to coordinate. Yes, Gabriela?
I do have a question, and this has to do with one of the chapters that I didn't read, and it's about the trials. When you were explaining them right now, I was very intrigued if you could elaborate more in terms of who were these volunteers, if they were volunteers, what was the setting, if you could just give us a bit more of the context in which these trials were taking place in Mexico. As you said, I think we know so much about the Puerto Rican trials. There are even the films and a play that has been done, but if you could elaborate more about what was taking place in Mexico, that would be a question that arose from your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the pill trials started in 1959. This family planning clinic, which was founded by Dr. Idris Rey, who had experience in the trials in Puerto Rico, but she was in collaboration with several Mexican doctors, including women doctors like Maria Eugenia Perales. I think that was, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they received funding from the Planned Parenthood Federation, International Planned Parenthood Federation, and Syntex to test norethindrone on Mexican women. And I based this chapter on the clinical trials and also on the personal correspondence that Idris Rey was sending to other doctors, and also there's philanthropists like Clarence Gamble in the US, in which she tells them like things in Mexico are different. Here and one doesn't know to what extent those claims were based actually on what was going on in the context, because I didn't find any opposition or any protests from the Catholic Church, or in this case, even like communists or anything. It was mostly like a fear that those doctors had, or like just Catholics and communists. So they never called this clinic Planned Parenthood clinic or anything. They named the clinic as offering maternal health services, maternal and gynecological services. And well, apparently it was rolling on word of mouth, the participation of women in the trials. In comparison to the Puerto Rican trials, they weren't following the women in their houses and asking them to take the pill or anything. They had to come to the clinic voluntarily to report their symptoms and so on and so forth. And they also tried to offer them like a more comprehensive healthcare services. And they even had like a psychologist at the clinic, social workers, and in her letters, Idris Rey says like, I see these women as humans, as more than just participating in the trials. I care about their other problems beyond their desire to stop pregnancy. And there is this constant flow of correspondence saying like how they didn't have enough supplies of Norlutin to provide the women. They were so many, and they were even like calling their friends, their acquaintances to come to get the pill to prevent pregnancies. So yeah, I hope that at least on the surface answers the question of how these trials were developed, and then they went on to the mid-1960s, and later the clinic was trying like other pharmaceuticals from different companies. So they started with syntaxes for drug, but they continued with other companies. Yes.
That's terrific. I have a follow-up comment. Are you familiar with the work of Maria Carranza in Costa Rica?
I'm not.
I think it might be of interest to you because she looks at Costa Rican women. I don't know if it's still the case, but Costa Rica had the highest rate of interuterine devices. And she followed a group of women as to why they would go to these clinics to get this. So it might be an interesting way to have a conversation with some of the sources that you cannot get in terms of trying to find why Mexican women were going to these clinics. And while they're not the same, it might give you an idea as to why women of all classes were going to these clinics to find reproductive care. If Aurora, if I may ask one other question, if there isn't another.
Yes, of course. Perhaps I would just like to introduce a brief comment. I think, Marta Liliana, that from the generation of my mother and like her friends, I've heard some conversations about these clinics. And so perhaps we can find some women who actually went to those clinics and you could interview them. I will ask, I will make some more questions on that to some acquaintances and let you know.
That is incredible. Yes, please. I will follow up on that.
That sounds amazing. And I just had one question. Liliana, I would love to know if there was something that really surprised you about this story, because I think we have an idea when we talk about the development of contraceptive trials or the development of the pill in other locations. And we have those stories, we have that narrative. I would love to know if there was something about this story that you came in thinking you understood, but it surprised you.
Wow. I think I was expecting to see more like how to say it, resistance or questions, particularly because many of the well, according to the clinical reports, many of the women in the trials identified as Catholics, and I don't know. I thought that somehow they were going to have more questions, more doubts about like if it was okay for them to take the pill or not. Yeah. And the other thing is that, despite the Catholic Church and all what it implied, the Mexican government as a pronatalist state, and also very nationalist and different officials explaining how birth control was a foreign imposition in Mexico, and etc. Those family planning clinics became like a safe space, apparently, for these women to get contraception. They didn't have to get like permission from their husbands or anyone in the clinic. They didn't ask them. I mean, they asked them if they were married or single, but they didn't really take note or on like if they've had any agreement with their husbands, nothing. And they were very, because of the nature of the clandestinidad of these clinics, they seem like they were safe from, I don't know, the patriarchal authority from the state, from their husbands, and also from the church. So I think that's what surprised me. I was expecting, I guess, at first to see a bit more like, I don't know, a bit more, yes, black and white portray of what was going on there. And yes, of course, that doesn't mean that the doctors working in those clinics were seeing, well, they had biases about the women attending the clinics, and particularly how those doctors wanted poor urban women to get the pill. They were their priority. So I mean, it was there are a lot of claroscuros in this story, and I think that it's very informed by how the Mexican context was and the political conjunctures were developing in the country. So I think that's what makes it so particular. And also like those fears about communism that were like very in the Cold War discourse, and like logics of the US physicians that came to Mexico to work in those clinics and so on. I mean, that's just really interesting to me how they had this idea that either the Catholics or the communists were going to prevent them from working, or like they were going to oppose birth control, which wasn't really the case.
Thank you.
Every aspect of this topic is so fascinating. We would spend hours talking, and I hope we have the time at some moment in person to be able to do so here in Mexico or somewhere else. We should organize some meeting on these issues. Yes. Well, so I think it is time. I don't know if there's any further comment or question, but I think it's time for letting our colleagues from the Oxfam American Martin Diskin Dissertation Award to have their time to present their own award. Thank you very much all for being here. And I should tell you, Marta Liliana, that also Ana Maria and Gemma send their greetings and congratulations. They really, really like your work as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was wonderful.
And hope to meet you soon.
Congratulations.
Ciao.
Oops. Buenos días. Tengo el honor de ser el portador de el premio, digamos, de la información de que tenemos una premiada para el LASA Oxfam America Diskin Dissertation Award del año 2023. No fui yo el presidente de este jurado, estoy aquí en sustitución del profesor Mauricio Archila Neira de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, que era el presidente de este comité, pero que no pudo estar aquí, ni tampoco podía participar a distancia. Quiero informarles que el comité de este premio estuvo integrado por David Smiley de Tulane University, un servidor, Alberto Olvera Rivera, de la Universidad Veracruzana, y María del Rosario Castro Bernardini, de Oxfam América, y el propio profesor Mauricio Archila. Todo esto un poco accidentado porque tuvimos que reemplazar en medio del proceso a la profesora Sonia Álvarez, quien por razones físicas no pudo continuar con esta labor. Debo decir que para el comité encargado de esta premiación hubo a la vez satisfacción y un poco de confusión. Satisfacción porque las tesis que nos fueron presentadas fueron extraordinarias, eran muy buenas todas las tesis, francamente. eran muy pocas, solamente tuvimos 5 concursantes, todas eran en inglés y de universidades norteamericanas. No tuvimos ninguna tesis producida en América Latina. De manera que el premio, me temo, se ha convertido en un premio a la mejor tesis hecha en Estados Unidos. Y creo que esto no debería ser en LASA, creo que deberíamos tener una apertura mayor. Se producen cientos de tesis doctorales en América Latina cada año, muchas de ellas de extraordinaria calidad, me consta. He sido jurado de muchas y me parece que es importante que LASA como institución tenga la apertura de invitar a más participantes a este tipo de reconocimientos. Antes de explicar por qué le dimos el premio a Diana Dajer, quiero decir que Margarita López Maya, la presidenta de LASA, que estaba aquí en su momento, se ha disculpado con ustedes porque está enferma, tiene una infección ocular y tiene que ir al médico, entonces se disculpa por no estar presente, pero deja por supuesto su reconocimiento a la premiada. Bueno, dicho todo lo anterior, hemos de decir que el jurado decidió premiar la tesis doctoral de Diana Dajer, Pathways to Inclusion and Exclusion, an Analysis of Medellin's Participatory Budgeting Process, que impresionó al jurado por su alta calidad académica, debido a la solidez metodológica, profundo trabajo de campo con el uso de diferentes métodos y técnicas de investigación, así como una importante contribución teórica a la literatura sobre procesos institucionales de gobernanza participativa, como lo son los del presupuesto participativo y su conexión con los procesos de inclusión política en los esfuerzos de paz y democratización en el caso de Medellín. Es muy interesante la conexión que en esa tesis se hace, pues, entre el presupuesto participativo y otras formas de participación que tienen que ver con los problemas de seguridad y de búsqueda de paz en Medellín. Este trabajo, además, establece vínculos claros entre la práctica académica y el activismo desde la conceptualización del proyecto, el diseño del proceso de investigación y el producto final, que busca ser utilizado en procesos de elaboración de presupuesto y planificación participativa a nivel local. Con eso quiero decir que el gran mérito que localizamos en esta tesis excelentemente escrita y presentada fue precisamente que abordaba no solo uno de los temas clásicos que en América Latina han impulsado la innovación democrática, que es la participación y sobre todo la vía del presupuesto participativo, sino también atiende en un sentido que ahora seguramente nos va a explicar Diana, los problemas que también conocemos muy bien de la violencia y los esfuerzos de construcción de paz territorial en Medellín, que fue durante algunos años, como ustedes saben, una especie de capital mundial del crimen. Hay que notar entonces que para los habitantes de América Latina, estos dos temas están estrechamente vinculados y son de importancia estratégica para el futuro de nuestras naciones. No solamente se trata de impulsar la profundización democrática a través de mecanismos participativos, sino ahora estamos muy concentrados en la construcción de paz, dado que la violencia criminal se ha extendido de una manera extraordinaria y preocupante en toda la región. De manera que un estudio que busca crear algún puente en este sentido es de gran trascendencia académica y política a la vez. Insisto en este último punto, el propósito de Diana en su trabajo fue no solamente construir conocimiento, sino desarrollar mecanismos útiles en la práctica social para facilitar la participación de la ciudadanía y crear lazos de confianza a nivel de base. Esta es mi breve presentación. Voy a dejarle la palabra a Diana. No sabía yo que podía ser un comentarista, no sé si lo hiciste, pero si no, te dejo la palabra para que nos expliques a todos su trabajo. Y felicidades a Diana por su premio.
Gracias. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Alberto. Un gusto estar con todos ustedes acá y recibir este premio que para mí significa estar parada en hombros de gigantes, de Martin Diskin, pero también de Terry Cole ayer que fue conmemorada, de Jenny Pierce, de Timothy, que está acá también y ha sido una parte importante en mi investigación y al inicio especialmente, que me ayudó en el desarrollo, y de mi supervisora, Bettina Lang, de Lee Payne también, que ha sido una parte importante de mi investigación, quien fue mi examinadora final, y también Stephanie McNulty, que también fue parte del comité de supervisión. Entonces me siento muy honrada de poder honrar ese trabajo que personas que admiro tanto han desarrollado por décadas, y hacer un poquito de contribución en este sentido y tener la oportunidad de compartirla hoy a todos y todas ustedes, esperando que en ese espíritu de Martin Diskin pueda cambiar esa realidad a través de una producción académica sólida. Voy a presentar en inglés porque mi tesis fue escrita en este idioma, pero justamente como mencionabas, Alberto, también creo que parte de los aprendizajes de esta investigación es la importancia de generar una producción mucho más grande desde el sur global y en español. Así que alguno de los retos que tengo ahora es poder empezar estas traducciones. La tesis se llama Pathways to Inclusion and Exclusion, an Analysis of Medellin's Participatory Budgeting Process, y básicamente se enmarca en ahora sí voy a pasar a inglés. It is embedded in a wave of democratic innovation that takes place in America Latina in the late 80s, when lots of countries of Latin America started enacting mechanisms of participatory democracy as a way to tackle the exclusion of marginalized populations that had been at the core of violence in many countries of the region. This is a study broadly in Latin America. Lindsay Maika, that was also awarded this award in 2013, studies this phenomena, and also the challenges of enacting participatory mechanisms in Latin America, because there's a lot of hope that they will tackle the crisis of democratic representation, but at the same time they have many challenges in their implementation. One of the mechanisms that has been particularly popular to include marginalized populations in political decision-making processes in Latin America is participatory budgeting. You can see here a map of the participatory budgeting world atlas that shows a broad range of participatory mechanisms. This compares pre-pandemic in 2,416 mechanisms versus post-pandemic 319. This is 2020 and 2021 data. And in Colombia has not been strange to this wave. In the late 80s, Colombia started enacting many participatory mechanisms to tackle political violence. One of the main ones have been or many of those were part of the political process that led in the early 90s in the current Constitution of Colombia, the Constitution of 1991, but also in the peace agreement with FARC, a guerrilla group. Colombia included around 1,000 mechanisms of participatory democracy as a way to include marginalized populations that have been traditionally excluded from political decision-making processes. And this is a way in the reasoning of the negotiators and in many cases of Colombia where participatory budgeting is part of peace building. This is part of a broader process of tackling political exclusion as one of the structural causes of violence in Colombia. The inclusion of participatory budgeting in Colombia started in 1996 in a city called Pasto, but then it has expanded to several cities of Colombia, one of them being Medellin, which is the second biggest city of Colombia. And it has a very difficult history of violence, both due to drug dealing, but also due to the political exclusion of lots of marginalized population from public decision-making processes who started to take arms as a way of deciding and creating the security that the state was not providing. In 2004, Medellin enacted participatory budgeting as a way to start creating, fostering more citizen participation in the city as a way of tackling violence. This was part of a broader framework of including a broad range of participatory mechanisms to tackle violence, and participatory budgeting was actually one of them. But sadly, and this has been very recurrent in Medellin, on and on, there are stories of illegal groups and armed groups capturing the participatory budgeting process. And this is counterintuitive. How can a mechanism that is implemented to counter violence, to tackle violence, then become more violent and be captured by the illegal groups who in order to capture the process, start attacking the population and even killing the population? So I was very interested in this phenomena because participatory budgeting was included in the peace agreement between the FARC guerrilla group and the Colombian government, but it's also embedded in this participatory wave and can say a lot and teach us a lot in terms of how to enact properly a participatory mechanism to effectively counter violence. And this case was also very interesting because when I started my research in 2016, Medellin was starting to use digital tools in the process of participatory budgeting. And at the time, there was not that much skepticism in terms of using technology in democracy. Now we know more, as Terry knows, about how to use technology effectively. But at that time, there was a lot of technological evangelism and a lot of thinking that if you can have an app where people can vote, then the process is not going to be captured. So I was very interested in understanding better how Medellin's participatory budgeting process, or if Medellin participatory budgeting processes influences political inclusion and the role of technologies in this process. So I had two main questions that in a process that was very iterative and this was not straightforward, and Tim read very early my examination to do the research, the qualifying exam, and this was at that time all about transitional justice. We had a very interesting conversation where he pushed me to think this beyond transitional justice, and I still had some transitional justice in the thesis. I'm not going to mention this today because it will take a lot of time and it's very tangential to my thesis at the moment. But mainly I want to share two main questions that I explored in my thesis. The first one, which I think could help a lot in terms of democratic innovation in Latin American contexts that are in conflictive scenarios, is what is the influence of participatory budgeting on political inclusion, and what are the effects of digital tools on political inclusion in participatory budgeting processes? This were very big questions and very ambitious. So I did a research that involved lots of different methods of research. I carry out 70 semi-structured interviews and a process of design thinking that involved the design and trial of a digital tool for participatory budgeting with the Town Hall of Medellin. And lots of supporters that I will mention later. But to design this tool and also to explore political inclusion in participatory budgeting, I also carried out 7 focus groups, 80 participant observation exercises. I was very lucky because when I was doing my research, Medellin was carrying out a reform of the participatory budgeting process that took place at the City Council of Medellin. And these involved lots of different discussions with a broad range of participants. This was very enriching, very challenging for the research because then I had a lot of data that I needed to make sense out of. But this was very useful to get a real sense of the challenges and opportunities of participatory budgeting for political inclusion. And here you can see some of the pictures of my data collection process, including the observation of the reform at the City Council. And something was very interesting from the data because I started finding out that there were lots of effects or positive, but both negative outcomes of participatory budgeting regarding political inclusion in Medellin. I started seeing that for some participants, this was a qualitative research, and they found the process very meaningful for their political inclusion, as for instance, youth or women or elderly that have been traditionally excluded. They acknowledge the challenges, but they fare the process as very meaningful for their identities and for learning how to participate in democracy. But I also found that there were lots of examples of negative effects in terms of political inclusion. For instance, the capture of illegal groups, or even the capture that I could observe in my research of politicians that gave citizens papers outside the voting ballots to tell them what projects to vote for, because that they were used as political clientelism. So it was very difficult to make sense of all this data. And I remember having lots of discussions with many people that supported, and my supervisor about, for instance, thinking if I could have any quantitative percentage of this is 50% inclusion, 50% exclusion. It's very difficult to measure. But what I did is that I used Corbin and Strauss' grounded theory approach to make sense of all this data. And as you know, this is a process that is highly iterative. You start taking chunks of data, codifying them, making sense of them, creating categories, merging them, and then until you get to the substantive theory. And with that, I got very interesting insights that I think might be useful for all the Latin American context and also for Colombia. But before jumping into that, I just want to share with you the definition of political inclusion that I use, that is built based on the data, given the grounded theory approach of my research. So I define political inclusion as an experience of participation that gives the possibility to all citizens, especially those who are marginalized, to collaborate with and have an effect on public governance decisions. And the end result of the thesis is a story of two cities, basically, of political inclusion and political exclusion in Medellin's participatory budgeting, that I call the pathways to inclusion and exclusion in Medellin's participatory budgeting process, which I hope it can help analyze other participatory budgeting processes in other places and also maybe other participatory mechanisms. I start the creation of this typology by understanding something that was very important for me to understand as I analyze the data, which is that underneath participatory budgeting lies a power battle between diverse actors. And you cannot understand a process of democratic innovation without acknowledging that this is a process of power, and political inclusion requires to understand power dynamics. And I think, at least for me, when I started this process, I had a very naive approach where I didn't realize how important the power dynamics on the ground were for the success of political inclusion in participatory budgeting. And the first thing that I started to understand was that there were three categories of actors that I could make sense of. There were actors that I called of representative democracy, for instance, the city councillors, the town hall that are elected. There were some actors of direct democracy, for instance, the citizens that participated directly in the process by voting, by doing the local development plans that were later voted. And there were actors that I classified as undemocratic, meaning that they did not comply with the rules of the process. And these actors were twofold. There were some actors that acted with arms, such as members of illegal armed groups that use arms to threat people to vote for the projects, or there were actors that were unarmed, which use tactics that were not lawful, such as deceiving the voters to vote for X or Y project, saying that if they did so, they will gain something out of it, but then hijacking the process. And once I realized that there was this power battle between these actors, and in one of the chapters I classify all these battles, and this is of course qualitative, this is not rocket science, and a typology, and something that was very challenging was to feel that I was oversimplifying something that is very complex, but I hope that this helps make sense of reality. Once I realized this power battle, I started to understand that those clashes of power shaped the legal design of the process, and I could identify three different stages of the design of the process, where both in the city council and in the courts, there were many participants that challenged the process for it to work in their advantage. For instance, some ediles, we were elected members of the community, wanted to decide the whole budget, so they challenged the process in courts because they didn't want citizens to decide directly the budget, because that took the power away from them. And something very interesting about this legal design is that it can change. Sometimes, and I'm a lawyer from previous background, you give as a lawyer law as something given, and you ignore that the design is very powerful in producing the effect. So a main insight of this thesis is understanding that the way that the law is designed has effects on reality, and there's a huge difference in the law in the books and the law in the world. And once I understood this legal design, I also realized, and these are the pathways, that there were competing effects that could that I saw that happened in many cases in Medellin. That if when I made sense of them, I could explain what produced inclusion and what produced exclusion. And this is something that I call the virtuous and the vicious deployment of the budget. So I realized that, and this is basically a typology to differentiate the conditions that could lead to inclusion versus the ones that can lead to exclusion. So I realized that there are two competing effects in Medellin's participatory budgeting that can lead to inclusion and exclusion. One, and you can see here, is the transparency versus the opacity of the process, which claims it's about how transparent the process is. And the second one is the competition and the capture of the process, which is about how open it is to the participation of people. So in terms of capture, so one of the competing effects is the one that I was mentioning, capture against competition. All this is defined in the thesis. I'm not going to spend time here defining it because I know that we have little time and I just want to make sense of the whole theory. But I invite you to read the thesis if you want to read the definitions. But basically, the openness of the decision-making process shows that whenever there was capture of the process, either by illegal armed groups or by politicians that were directing voters to certain projects to use them as political clientelism, there was exclusion. Whereas where there was competition, meaning that actors comply with the rules of the process and participated without breaking those rules, and even if they lose the projects that they were voting for, they were happy with the projects because they were feeling that overall the needs of development of their communities were being accomplished. The second competing effect is opacity versus transparency. And here I realized that whenever there was not information about the process, about how the resources were spent, about when people file claims against some certain people because they were committing crimes in the process, and there were not the judiciary didn't act. All that opacity affected the inclusion in the process. So this is very important because the cases where there was transparency, and many times it was pushed by civil society, and those cases led to inclusion. Where the cases where there was opacity, for instance, lots of citizens filed claims against paramilitary groups that were capturing the process, but nothing happened. Those cases led to capture. So once I made sense of all of this, I understood that when you have transparency and competition, that in many cases led to inclusion. Whereas if there was opacity and capture, that in many cases led to exclusion, which was very interesting because I realized that for other cases of participatory budgeting, this could be an interesting typology to understand what could be needed in terms of the legal design and implementation of the process to produce political inclusion and exclusion. And something that was very interesting for me during the whole process of analyzing the data is that political inclusion is not enough to produce what I realized in the thesis many participants called empowerment, which was a real transformation in the realities of how the power fared in Medellin. And that political exclusion in many cases was not enough to exclude completely the participant from the process. Many participants were brave enough to continue trying to participate, but there was a point in many cases where exclusion led completely to disenfranchisement. So I came out to these two broad categories, which is the ones that I call the pathways to inclusion and exclusion, which is the school of citizenship, which is a process where you have transparency, where you have competition that leads to inclusion. And then with time, it's transformative enough that changes the power dynamics and it leads to empowerment of participants. And then you have the cycle of disenfranchisement, where you have opacity and you have capture, and that leads to exclusion, and that in some cases is extreme enough that it leads to a complete disenfranchisement of people from the participatory budgeting process. This needs to be understood as well, these pathways that I shared in something that was very important for me to realize as I was analyzing the data, which is two broader contexts that took place in Medellin at the same time. First, the conflictive context that affected political inclusion in Medellin's participatory budgeting process. And it's this is very important because sometimes I realized in the interviews, in the document, in the legal and policy documents that I researched, that policymakers and legislators don't acknowledge the conflictive context in which Colombia is embedded. And that leads to very poor design of policies and very poor design of laws. And what I realize is that if that is not acknowledged and you're not going to put in action in the design things that make the implementation aware of these challenges in terms of the conflict, that then there's not going to be any effect in terms of the change of the violence in Medellin, which is what happened in the process, where armed groups captured the process in many cases. And you can see here the homicides in Medellin actually augmented since 2007, and when participatory budgeting was intended to be a pacifier mechanism. And the second contextual analysis that I think is relevant is something that is called in the literature the participatory ecosystem. And something that I did in the thesis was to create some categories of analysis as well of three main things that are important to understand the participatory ecosystem of participatory budgeting in Medellin that I think could be also relevant for their context. The first one, and this is, of course, out of the data from the grounded theory approach. The first one is planning, which I realized was very important to understand participatory budgeting. And participants were very emphatic that participatory budgeting is not going to lead to peace and to inclusion if it's not linked with planning, because actually planning is at the core of the development of the cities. So that's what's very important for the participatory ecosystem, but also understanding that there are dynamics of the whole budget that needs to be understood to understand political inclusion. And for instance, just realizing, and this was something that came out of the data as well, how little it's the budget of Medellin's participatory budgeting process regarding the whole budget. So it's just 5%. And many participants claim this is not inclusion. They're only giving us the opportunity to say something just for 5%. How are we going to be included in political decision making if this is only about this part that they are making us fight for? So that was very important to understand about the political context. But then something I just want to comment now on the second question that I had. So the first question, remember, it was, what is the influence of participatory budgeting on political inclusion in Medellin? And then I realized that there were two competing effects, the pathways to inclusion and the pathways to exclusion. And then the second question was about the role of digital tools in this relationship. And what I realize with the research, it's very interesting because this was part of a participatory action research with the Town Hall of Medellin and with lots of organizations that supported the research and participants of the city, of citizens. And we started this process thinking that, and this was a time where there was a lot of enthusiasm towards the apps that you downloaded in the cell phone. We started thinking that if we had an app that people could download in their phones to vote in their cell phones or in their computer, that could make a lot in terms of participation and political inclusion in the process. It was very counterintuitive, and I love this part of the research, which was discussing this with the participants of Medellin's participatory budgeting process and realizing first that they distrusted the digital tools that the state provided. And second, that digital tools could both produce opacity and transparency. Digital tools if you don't realize that there's a digital divide, and that if you don't design this with the people and using the tools that people use commonly, they actually could lead to capture as well of the process, but as well to competition. So these two competing effects of capture and competition, but also of transparency, of opacity, were found in the design of the digital tool of Medellin's participatory budgeting process. And I understood in the research that there are designs that could lead to inclusion, and also digital tool designs that can lead to exclusion. So instead of the app that I was sharing, we created a platform that was only focused on planning, because community felt that if the digital tool was about the budget, it could lead to more capture, whereas people needed to change their mindset to understand that budget is important if it realizes needs of the communities that are agreed in a deliberative process of planning. So the tool is called Nuestro Desarrollo, or development, and it includes a platform where people can build their plans and design them together, but also a game, which was very interesting because many participants felt that gamification of these processes could help change dynamics on the ground, because it helped people think outside the real process and then engage more effectively in democracy. So the game is called Nuestra Comunidad, our community, and it acts as a hook to engage citizens that are highly disengaged of the process. And it basically helps encourage them to build their ideal community in terms of sports, of social inclusion, of transportation. And it's basically challenges where they can, in sports, they can score goals, they can also recycle, they can paint graffitis on the walls, they can pick people at the Metrocable in transportation, or they can pave the streets, and then they can use those points to build their ideal city and to solve problems in their communities. And then this leads them to the platform where they can plan the diverse plans. This was very interesting for the research. And something that, and this is the activist part of the research, it was licensed to this tool to the Town Hall of Medellin, and they are using it now for the planning process of Medellin, not the participatory budgeting process, but actually to support the liberation on the ground to build the local development plans. And so I have told you all this story about political inclusion and exclusion in Medellin. So what? Why is this important for Latin America? So I want to share with you 3 main insights and a closing remark. The first one is that, and I started this, I mentioned this before, power dynamics are relevant. They are very important, and they are at the core of democratic innovation, and they should not be overlooked. And something that I found in many of the studies that I read of participatory budgeting is that they overlook power dynamics. Alexandra Bello, which was mentored, supervised by Jenny, I read her, and it was mind changing for me in terms of understanding better power dynamics, especially of criminal groups on the ground in Medellin. So I think that those studies need to be encouraged of understanding better who are the actors and making sense of those relationships, because those relationships matters to understand the whole process. Then something very important that I think could be also valuable for other processes is that the control over the process, and something that is relevant both for the competition and for the transparency, is that the state is important to make sense out of this, but something that I value a lot and taught me a lot of imagine is the power of citizenship and civil society organizations that have fought for decades to be able to decide for their communities, and the citizen oversight and community organizing in Medellin should be nurtured, because it's the one that have made this process produce something meaningful despite all the challenges. And the third one is that the legal and digital design matters to shift power dynamics and battle exclusion by design, but also implementation and how that design is implemented in terms of the opacity and the transparency, the capture and the competition is very important, and that could lead to more effective implementation of participatory mechanisms. You can have here the links to the thesis and a recent article that I published out of it. But I just want to finish with a note linking this with yesterday's talk by Terry Cole. I admire her a lot, and lots of, like Jenny, I also admire a lot your work and team and so many people that are here and that have helped my research. Lee Payne and Stephanie McNulty, Bettina Lang, my supervisor, and I'm super proud that many of them are women. And Terry was talking yesterday that there are reasons to be hopeful despite all the troubles in the world at the moment. And I think that understanding better this phenomena and understanding that despite all the exclusion that you can find in these mechanisms, such as capture of illegal armed groups, there are people on the ground fighting for this, and also finding a way of making this process more inclusive and a real experience of empowerment for many, that gives hope, along with the work produced by all of these people that inspired me a lot. So I'm very grateful for being able to be part of this moment of history and be inspired by all of you and all of them. And also, I just want to thank as well to all the people that supported my research, Colciencias, now MinCiencias, which is the government agency for research in Colombia. Also the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship. This was at some point a social entrepreneurship project that led to creating an enterprise in Colombia. That's a whole different story, because I needed to find a way to license this to Medellin's town hall. And also to Colfuturo, to Build Up, which is an organization that works in technology for conflict transformation. They finance a huge part of building the digital tool, and Elena Puig, Jen Gaskell, and Micaela Ledesma were amazing mentors in the technological part. I was a lawyer trying to create a digital tool for democracy, so that needed a lot of support. And just my family, my husband and my daughter, and my father and mother. My father died in January this year. It was very difficult, but being here and being able to acknowledge his presence, it gives me hope as well. So thank you very much.
No tenemos tiempo de nada, pero creo que no. Bueno, muchas gracias. No quise yo decir nada del trabajo de Diana porque se sabía de su capacidad expresiva extraordinaria, como pudimos ver. Así que se confirma que en efecto este trabajo está en el mejor espíritu de Martin Diskin, que es una combinación de una investigación de altísima calidad académica y de un efecto práctico en la vida de la gente a través de este esfuerzo de hacer accesible el conocimiento tecnológico, una herramienta digital, y además con el conocimiento detrás de la herramienta de cómo evitar su captura política. Eso es algo notable y original de este trabajo. Entonces, si alguien quiere decir algo rapidísimo, porque estamos sobre el tiempo, alguno de los presentes quiere decir algo, hágalo ahora, por favor. Bueno, si no, les agradecemos mucho su presencia a nombre de LASA, de este comité, y pues de nuevo una felicitación a este trabajo extraordinario, innovador de Diana, que merece por mucho este premio, y exhorto a Diana y a todos los demás a que para futuros años propongamos más tesis también producidas en América Latina. Disculpen mi insistencia, pero creo que este es uno de los temas en donde LASA ha fallado, en la promoción de sus premios y reconocimientos en América Latina. Entonces creo que si nos apuramos, encontraremos nuevas oportunidades de reconocer trabajos tan buenos como este. Muchas gracias. Felicidades a ambas premiadas.